Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to talk about boundaries and cynicism. So this comes from a friend of mine on Facebook. And as always, I have permission to use his story. And also, as always, we want to protect his identity. So we are going to refer to him as John, as we usually do for our male story people, I guess. John is a school teacher, and he is newer to being a school teacher. I want to say he has been for probably less than a decade, right around there.
Okay.
So
Okay.
he's
Do you know what
newer.
grade?
He
he's in?
teaches sixth grade.
Sixth grade. Okay.
Yeah. And he has set some boundaries at work. And a lot of these boundaries that he has set come from a negative place. So how I got the idea for this episode is John posted on Facebook, and I asked if I could make it a podcast episode. And he very obligingly said yes. So I'm going to read the initial Facebook post, and then we'll get into kind of some of these boundaries that John has set and why.
Right.
All right. The original Facebook post says, I'm going to work on being more positive and less cynical. But the question I have is how I'm going to balance that with boundary setting skills I have worked on in the last few years, which came at the cost of being more cynical.
So let me tell you my first response to that, because our listeners, probably understand that we talk about future topics. And so you let me see that maybe a week ago or 2 weeks ago. And at the time, I remember thinking, okay, I'm not seeing the connection of how does one become cynical by setting boundaries. And so that was my first question. And now I think you're going to go ahead and give more of a narrative, which for me clears it up. And I'm going to let people know, I think these are two distinct issues. And I'll explain why I think that's so.
Okay.
Not connected. I'm pretty sure they're not connected.
Okay. So we talked quite in depth about this. And in order to protect his identity, I'll vague things up a little bit. So I'm not going to be too specific. So his main issue is that he has problems with his administration at the school he works with. So mainly the principal, his previous principal. So he's got a new principal this year, and his previous principal, they were very laid back, but then they kept adding responsibilities to teachers' plate. They didn't treat the teachers very well, is what I gathered. They were talked down to, and they set unrealistic expectations. And so one of the things that John acknowledges right off the bat that we're going to get into later is he acknowledges that he has a problem with authority. And so one of the other things that I try to do is I try to, as much as possible, where I can, I keep things in their words. So these are John's words. He says, what I really don't show a lot is that I have problems with authority. I don't like being told what to do. My immediate impulse is to want to not do it. But I've also found that if I'm presented with reasoning, data, or logic, even if I disagree with the decision, I'm more willing to follow it simply because there's a reason. And I feel like a lot of people probably feel that way. I mean, I don't think anybody likes to be told you have to do this really monotonous, obnoxious thing.
Right. It's kind of like that old thing people said in the Army, they'll go dig a hole. And then after you go fill it up, I mean, it's kind of like that. It's a pointless task. And that is hard for most people. Yeah.
Yeah. But if there's a reason that you're digging the hole, like, okay, yeah, I don't want to dig the hole, but I'll go dig the hole. Whereas if you're just digging the hole because it's a character building exercise and it's just to help, you're doing it just because you're learning to be told what to do, I could see people fighting against that. So as a result of all of this, here are the boundaries that John set. So he said he was doing absolutely zero work outside of contract hours because it doesn't matter. They were giving us too much to do, even if we say no. So if I don't get it all done, that's fine. And if they ask why I didn't, I tell them why. Be honest when asked about things I'm struggling with, but don't volunteer it because that looks whiny. Since we couldn't say no, I just didn't do things I saw weren't being enforced or didn't do things I didn't think mattered. I don't get on students for dress code, for example, like I'm supposed to. I don't give penalties for late work like I'm supposed to, etc. Cynicism drove my boundary making, not the other way around. And the problem I'm facing now, driving me to this decision, is that I'm projecting a lot of my problems with the last principal on the newest one. So I can't really tell if she's just as bad or if I'm making her seem just as bad in my head. And so it sounds like there's already been a little bit of a clash with this new principal. And I won't go into the specifics of it, but he's already had a little bit of difficulties and he wants to develop a better relationship with her, but he's struggling with that because he feels in the past like he hasn't been treated well. And that's
Yeah.
very common. If you don't feel like you're treated well in your workplace, you're not going to want to perform well. You're not going to feel like you're doing your best work.
So I have a lot of ideas. I'm going to try and keep them straight. You tell me
Okay.
if I'm being confusing.
Okay.
See, I think what's happening is in this situation with John in the workplace, I'd put forward the idea that I think he's cynical anyway.
Okay.
I mean, if we think about cynicism, and that comes from actually something that's in there that you didn't read, an exchange he had with his spouse.
Yes. Okay. So we can get into that. He said, and I will just call his wife, just
Okay.
for simplicity's sake.
Okay.
Yeah. These are his words. Yeah. It finally clicked today as I'd been tired of feeling angry and tried to look more objectively. Then my wife told me I was being too negative and I didn't feel like I needed to say she was wrong or anything. She was right. And then she pointed out that I'm constantly looking at things I want more money, bigger TV, etc., and that I rarely show appreciation for what I have. And again, she was dead on. It was an easy decision to make. And honestly, the boundaries I had to make and are refining are all workplace.
So what that says to me is I'm seeing a little bit of pessimism here
Okay.
in him. And I think that connects with cynicism. And so cynicism is the belief that other people are really motivated by their own self-interest. Now, I want to agree with him that I think in that context, the way he's describing it, I would guess his principal or the people in charge, if I were in there, I'd be cynical as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because it sounds to me like they are acting in their own self-interest and certainly not in the interest of their teachers.
Right.
And so I understand how he can say in the workplace he's being cynical.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. But I think it's disconnected from his difficulty with authority and then his what I would guess is his overall pessimism.
Okay.
Which is the thing that leads to a lack of appreciation. But I think that they're co-occurring, right, in this setting. And so I think that's the reason that, in my opinion, he's made an error in linking them together. I think they're separate. So yes, he has a problem with authority, which probably comes from, well, probably it does come from typically past experiences. And then also he's probably cynical, but I would guess he's probably cynical in other contexts as well.
Mm-hmm.
So if we go back to the trouble with authority first, I think that I'm going to call them, if you have benevolent leaders, I don't know, does such a thing exist as benevolent leaders? I think it can, especially in that setting. Then I think that it's much easier when you're told, well, I'd like you to do this or this or this, because you have this feeling that, in this case, say the principal really cares about you, cares about your work, is really trying to facilitate you being a better teacher. I don't pick up any of that from, his narrative at all.
Yeah.
And so in that setting, it makes sense to me. I think most people might be a little bit cynical in that setting. So I'm trying to validate that piece, for him. But if he wants to change the way he is reacting, say, to the new principal, which I think is part of what he wants, right? Is, maybe he can explore where does that difficulty with authority come from? probably from a past experience with, some other authority figure. But I think also, and I'm not saying this is true for John, often cynicism can really come from previous wound, say
Okay. Yeah.
previous emotional wound somewhere. If he just tries to think about, well, what is it in his life? And typically, it probably is a person who had some sort of authority over him. What's the emotional hurt that was caused? Now, that's just a
Mm-hmm.
guess. I'd love to,
Mm-hmm.
to been able to ask him those questions. But again, I'm throwing this out. Hopefully he'll listen to the episode
Mm-hmm.
and just think about that. Where does the cynicism come from? I think he could look at it as pessimism if we go back to what, that interchange between he and his wife.
Right.
So here's what I think. We've talked about this before. I think you can change that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can do that by a really focused and intentional practice of appreciation.
Right.
Because I think a lot of it is habit. I would guess, you know him well, and you could probably make a guess on this. If he stepped back and really looked at his life, there are probably a lot of things in his life to appreciate.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think he would acknowledge that.
Yeah. And so I think that on a daily basis, this is what
Mm-hmm.
we've talked about before. On a daily basis, if you just take 5 minutes, typically in the morning as you start your day, and just, name a couple of things out loud. I appreciate this, in my life. And I think it's important to kind of go one step further and say, here's the reason I appreciate it, or here's what this thing that I appreciate does for my life, or here's what it gives to me or my family or my wife. And so it takes just a few minutes. But
Mm-hmm.
if you make a habit, it totally changes the way you approach the day.
Yeah.
And so you really shift over time your mindset from being more pessimistic to being more appreciative. Appreciation is really an amazing thing that it can do for us. And often it's just a habit. And I would, maybe he didn't learn that, say, in his family growing up.
Right.
And so it's, in some ways, it's a skill. I think of it as a skill or a habit that he can learn.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I think appreciation can go a long way, and we've talked about this idea too, that it's very natural for us to focus on the negative.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught in that rut. And it's also very easy to, especially when you get caught up in your own aspirations, right? And you set goals for yourself and you start to want all of these things and you start to just want more and more, and all of a sudden your aspirations just grow and grow and grow. And I'm not saying that this is John necessarily, but I'm just saying people in general tend to do this. Your aspirations grow and you start thinking about all the things you want and all the things that you would like, that you forget to enjoy what you have in the moment.
Right. Yeah.
And,
It's easy to have.
yeah, I mean, and everybody should have goals. Goals are great. And I think it's
Mhm.
awesome to want to improve yourself, to want to better yourself, to want to better your situation in life. But don't forget to enjoy the journey. You need to enjoy getting there. That's one of the things that I try to focus on when it comes to motherhood, because in motherhood, it's so easy to look forward to when my kids are just a little bit older, a little bit more independent, all of these things that I can do. And there are things that I look for, things that I'm looking forward to being able to do with some more independence. But I try to really focus each day on enjoying the phase that I'm in, right? So I'm
Mhm.
trying to enjoy my kids and the phase that they are now. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say I loved every second of the newborn phase and that baby phase, because there were times where it was hard and it just flat out was awful. And
Yeah.
so, I'm not saying that we should just sugarcoat everything, but I tried really hard to cherish those moments in motherhood that weren't difficult. I tried really hard to cherish when my baby snuggled with me, or when they would do sweet things. And I try to cherish, the innocent relationship that I have with my kids, and the fact that they still really like me, because I know with teenagers they tend to like mom and dad a little less
Uh,
sometimes. And so, I'm trying to enjoy the journey. And so I think that's maybe my main takeaway, or the point that I'm trying to make, is that don't forget to enjoy the journey of progression.
right. I think it's a really good point because you can appreciate the things you have
Hmm.
that are good in your life, and you can also look forward to something different. Those two can coexist in the same space. They make sense.
Yeah.
I appreciate what I have now, but down the road, I would like this. Nothing
Mhm.
wrong with that. So I
Yeah.
think that if we address the issue of boundaries specifically with John, but I think more generally in the workplace, setting boundaries in the workplace, it's difficult
Yes.
because there's such a power imbalance,
Yep.
right? Between, in this case, say the principal and the teachers, or the power imbalance, say the boss and the worker, and then another context. And so you have to be very careful because I think setting boundaries and we'll talk more generally about how important that is. Setting boundaries generally is a good idea, but you could risk losing your job,
Yep.
right? If you aren't careful enough. And
Mhm.
so you have to decide what's the trade-off. Like there's always a cost to, in fact, setting boundaries even within the context of, say, a family, there's always a cost to doing that.
Mhm.
And so if you can anticipate what's the probability that you might get fired or demoted? Or if you're setting a boundary in the family, what's the probability that my sister may not talk to me anymore? I mean, then you can make a more informed choice. So it's nice to say, yeah, I'm going to set a boundary. And I think he set some boundaries around. You'd mentioned in the narrative that, the principal is saying, just piling on more stuff, do this, do this, do this.
Mhm.
And I think at some point you have to be able to say, enough's enough. We can't do this.
Yeah.
But again, if the principal has hiring and firing power over you, that's a tough place to be. And then you
Right.
also have to it's complicated, and not just with John, but that idea of difficulty with authority, and the idea that which he acknowledged, if he has, a reason, or, if you have,
Explanation is the word you're
an
looking for.
explanation, a reasonable explanation for the reason and the for why you want something done, most people can understand that.
Yeah.
But it sounds to me like this is why I go back to I'd be cynical too. It sounds to me like that wasn't what was going on with the principal. And you didn't mention this, and hopefully this doesn't give anything away. It's about the principal who was going off to do something else anyway, right? He wasn't even staying in the principal he had trouble with, I think, was heading off to go somewhere else, a
Yeah.
different job. And so he himself didn't seem very happy to be in that position of being a principal, which might have been part of the problem.
Mhm. Well, and I mean, I would imagine too that a principal probably sets the tone for the whole school.
I think so.
And so if you've got a principal who is not treating the teachers well, the problems are just going to bleed down. I mean, the students are going to pick up for on that, and you're going to get into this awful cyclical pattern where the students are going to pick up that the teachers aren't happy. They're going to cause more problems, and the teachers are going to be even more unhappy. And teachers have a tough enough job. I often say I did not need a pandemic to understand how much I love and appreciate teachers. I
Mhm.
appreciated teachers before they forced us to homeschool our kids.
Yeah. But
You
I
know,
think that's true in any job. The
yeah,
leader, the boss, sets the tone
yeah,
for the whole office. And it can be a good and productive tone, and it can be an awful tone. It sounds like that previous principal was, really tough.
mhm,
So now he's got this new principal. That's why, and he realizes that he may be transferring some of his cynicism from one principle to the other. And he
yeah,
just needs to step back and think about that and maybe appreciate. There are probably some things he likes about his job. I hope
mhm,
there's some things that he likes about his job, about being a teacher.
mhm,
And, even to go into the school every day and be aware of there are things that are good about
yeah.
being there. And I think that then makes it easier.
So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is this idea that carrying, I guess, past cynicism into new relationships, right? So, and I mean, any type of relationship, right? Whether a work relationship, a romantic relationship, a friendship, what have you. So I think that's pretty common for people to do is, they have this previous experience and then they get into a similar situation and they immediately put up a defense because it reminds them of a previously awful situation. Am I making sense?
Yeah, and I think it's self-protective. I
Mhm.
mean, in a lot of ways, right? I've been hurt before by someone in this situation. I don't want to be hurt again.
Right.
So I'm going to put up my defenses. I'm going to put the walls up.
Mhm. Right, and I think that's very common. it's a very common thing for people to do, but I think we need to kind of step back and realize you're in a new situation, and give people a chance. And so, I think it's good that he is trying to look at this objectively, and he's recognizing that this is a new principal, this is a new boss. And so, I have a chance here to turn over a fresh leaf, right?
Yeah, and I agree with that. We should give people a chance. It's easier said than done, though.
Hmm.
And the situation that I encounter often in my office is typically with someone in a relationship who's been hurt. Say, they were married and their partner had an affair and they left the marriage, and then it becomes very difficult to trust anyone else. And so you can say, yeah, give the next person a chance. I mean, logically, it makes sense.
Right.
But emotionally, I think we're set up to really try and protect ourselves. And so it's really hard to take down those walls once we've been emotionally hurt like that.
Hmm.
And so often it depends on the strength of the emotional hurt. How long did the hurt go on? I think, though, with cynicism, I think in a lot of ways that can be a habit
Yeah.
that you can change. That's why I mentioned the appreciation exercise. And so I really would be curious with John, maybe next time you talk to him, see if he experiences being cynical in any other context.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I can ask
I'd be
him that.
curious about that.
So,
But also mention the word pessimism to
yeah.
him, see if
Yeah.
that fits. Because I think personally that
Hmm.
they're very close together.
Cynicism and pessimism, you think
Uh-huh.
they're pretty
Yeah.
close? I
Well, I mean, pessimistic about really, he's pessimistic about the motives of the people who are leading him, right?
and that makes sense, especially given his past experience.
Hmm.
I could see him, especially I do know that this is the first school that he is taught in.
Okay.
And so I think that could be another, I guess you might call it, underlying issue, is often teachers are so excited to get in there and make a difference in the lives of their students. And then they get in there and that's not how it is at all. Like it's almost like reality hits them and they realize that a lot of times these are just bratty little kids that you have to put up with for 6 hours a day,
Yeah.
right? 6 to 8 hours a day. And and that can be really hard for teachers. And I think that can be hard for a lot of people. I mean, I bet a lot of people experience that when they go into a profession and they're really passionate about it and they're excited and, they're ready to get in there and make a difference in the work that they do. And then they kind of go through this shift of perspective of, oh, yeah, I can make a difference sometimes, but there's a lot of suck that comes with it. There's a lot of just awfulness that comes
Hmm.
with whatever job you're doing.
Yeah. I think that I was just looking at our outline, and one of the things you wrote down is something to talk about is how do we let others influence us? Which I
Yes.
think is a really good question because you find that certainly in Gottman's work with couples,
Hmm.
one of the things I think I've mentioned before that he found in successful marriages that men will let their wives influence them. And often that doesn't happen. And so I was thinking about what is it that makes it more likely that we will let people influence us. And I think one of the things I use the word benevolent leader, but going back to if the person in power or authority over us, if we really feel like they care about us and they have our best interests in mind as well.
Hmm.
Because the whole thing with cynicism and the power with authority really comes down to, at least from John's narrative, it doesn't seem like the principal cares about him
Yeah.
or the teachers. I mean, there was something about test scores in there too. It almost seems like what he cares about is the test scores. It doesn't matter what happens, just get your test scores up. When really
Yep.
we're talking about people, the teachers, we're talking about students. There's so much more, I think anyway, to the experience of school for students than just raising your test scores.
Oh, yeah.
The way we learn how to be productive and good members of society. I mean, that's
Hmm.
where it starts. And so if the only focus is get your test score up, I think we're missing the point. But it almost sounded like that's what the principal anyway was focusing on. And I think that I mean, it didn't come out. John didn't come out and directly say this, but it almost seems like he sees that there's really something more that's important about teaching these kids and being with these kids.
Well, there has to be if you're going to be a teacher. I would imagine that if as a teacher, the only thing you care about is your students' test scores, kids are going to pick up on that and you're not going to be an effective teacher because kids aren't going to be able to relate to you very
Right. And
well.
I've heard this from other teachers. I mean, because that's a focus, that's not just a focus where you are, it's a focus all over, is
Yes.
getting the test scores up.
Yes.
And I think they missed the point
Yeah. And
of
I
really what is school about.
Yeah, I mean, and I get that, there has to be a standard, right? Kids have to be learning something in school, and I understand the need for a some sort of a standard for kids, but
Yeah.
I also agree that I don't think test scores should be the main emphasis. I think
No,
it
I
should be
think
more about progress.
well, progress, but also I think, especially say in elementary school, and then maybe less so as you get to middle school and less so as you go to high school, that I think it's about instilling a love for learning,
Yeah.
the process of learning. Because if at a young age you get the kids to be excited, say about learning something new, I mean, that is a really good thing to have later on in life, right?
Mhm.
But if what you're doing is just going through these mindless exercises in order to get my test score up,
Yep.
that doesn't give you a love of learning. And I think, it causes a lot of problems. So I think that it's more about focusing on these are people. They aren't just not, it's almost like the principal was saying they're just numbers. I mean,
Yes.
they're students and I want their numbers higher.
Yeah.
That that's not going to feel good to most people, especially I can't imagine it's going to feel good to most teachers.
No, and I mean, teachers need all the support and all of the help they can get. And I mean, I think that that's just going to create kind of a toxic work environment if your principal is more concerned about your test scores than, are you trying to make a difference in these kids' lives? Because I mean, 20 years from now, these kids aren't going to care about their test scores. Nobody's going to care about their 6th grade math test,
And it's
right?
not going to have anything to do with their success or not in life.
It's really not.
Absolutely nothing.
Yes, the test scores that you get in 6th grade have no bearing on your life. Now,
No.
and again, I understand the need for some sort of a standard. So we definitely need some sort of a way to measure, okay, is this teacher effective? Right.
Yeah,
And so,
yeah, I agree with that.
you
Yeah.
know, so I understand that, but the emphasis should not be the test scores. And so
No,
I can understand why John is cynical. I understand his cynicism.
I do too. And I hope I made that clear.
Yeah.
His cynicism in this context makes sense to me. But I'm surprised at the principal because I think nationwide we have trouble keeping good teachers.
Right.
One, they aren't paid enough, is
Mhm.
certainly true. But if you're treated that way, like, okay, all I really want you to do is get the numbers up, that's just not going to feel good for most people who go into teaching. I think they
Mhm.
want probably more of a relationship with the students. At least the really good teachers. I've treated some teachers, and that's the way they talk about their students. They have a love for the subject, and then they have a love for teaching it. And it's not about test score. Like no one ever
Yeah.
comes in and says, "Wow, my students got the highest test score in the state" or something.
Yeah.
I don't know that they care that much
No.
about.
No. Well,
So
I
his
mean,
cynicism makes sense,
yeah.
but I think that he would be happier. I think often when you're in that pessimistic mode or cynical mode, you aren't quite as happy as you could be.
Right. And so I think you need to find a way to be happy in whatever your situation is, right? You need to
With
find,
appreciate, and I think the
yeah,
the the pathway to that is by really looking for the things that you appreciate that are
right.
good.
Because you can't control other people.
No.
And so the only thing that you can work on is yourself and how
Right.
you react to the situation.
Yep.
How are you going to handle this? What is your attitude going to be? And I think that's what he's trying to accomplish and what he wants to accomplish is he wants to have a better relationship with his next principal or with his new principal than he did his old one, right? He wants to develop a better working relationship with her and he wants to give her a chance.
Yeah.
is what he's trying to do. And I think he can do that. I think he can still set these boundaries of, I am not going to work unrealistic hours. I'm not going to do an unrealistic amount of work as a teacher. I'm still open to your ideas. I'm still open to your suggestion. I can still respect you as a boss, but I still have my boundaries in place. So you can do
Right.
both.
You can do both. It's just harder in the workplace
Yeah.
because of that risk of being fired. And
Yeah.
so it's really tough to, strike the right balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one thing I did want to point out is I was impressed that he let his wife influence him, right? That
Hmm.
he kind of,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a good sign. And I know this couple fairly well. And I can say from my perspective, they have a really good relationship. They have a pretty
Hmm.
good marriage. And so I think they've been married for about around 7 years now.
Yeah.
And that's a positive, right?
Hmm.
Is the fact that,
Yeah.
his wife can say something that's
Yeah, she's pointing something out that I think, I mean, the way I listen to that is that she's concerned for his happiness.
exactly. And
Yeah.
rather than and he didn't just
Yeah.
get defensive about it, he kind of turned introspective about it and said, okay, she's right. And I would imagine that and it sounds like she did it in a way that was respectful, right? I
Hmm.
mean, and that's something we've talked about a lot in the past, is you have to be able to talk to your spouse about these kinds of things. You have to learn how to have
Always
that
about the
dialogue.
process,
Yes.
process. Yeah.
Yes.
How you
So,
do.
yes. And so, anyways, that was one thing that I wanted to point out, is that, you've got that going for you. So,
Yep. Yep.
all right. So next week we are going to get into people pleasers. So I think this is going to be a fun topic. Spoiler alert, I once was very much a people pleaser.
Oh, and I'm surprised we haven't done this before because it's
Yeah.
actually fairly common
Mhm.
for people pleasers to end up in therapy
Yeah.
because eventually it doesn't work very well
No.
because they lose
No.
themselves typically. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think it's going to be exciting to get into. I think it stems a lot from your childhood. At least I
Yeah.
know it did for me. So we're going to,
I think that's right.
yeah. Yeah. We'll dive into all that. All right.
Good.
And we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.